The shot echoed across the dusty plains of Colorado Territory, 1878, as Parker Kincaid fired his revolver into the air, his face twisted with fury. The young cowboy's temper was as legendary as his skill with a gun, and the ranch hands who'd been bickering over water rights scattered like frightened quail at his approach. "Next time I hear you fools arguing over something that ain't yours to decide," Parker growled, holstering his Colt with practiced ease, "I won't be wasting bullets on the sky." His voice carried across the ranch yard, harsh as the unforgiving sun beating down on their backs. At 26, Parker had already earned a reputation throughout the territory. Not as an outlaw, though some whispered he'd flirted with that life in his younger days, but as a cowhand who could break the wildest bronco and a foreman who brooked no foolishness. The Diamond K Ranch had prospered under his management, but no man stayed in his employment long if they couldn't stomach his volatile temperament. "Mr. Kincaid," called old Hank, the ranch cook who'd been around long enough to speak his mind without fear. "Mr. Kerrigan's riding in with company." Parker squinted against the sun to see two riders approaching, recognizing immediately the portly figure of Henry Kerrigan, the banker from Silver Creek. The second rider, however, gave him pause. Even at a distance, the delicate posture and the flash of skirts told him it was a woman. He spat into the dust, irritation prickling his skin. "What business does Kerrigan have bringing a woman out here?" No one answered, wisely keeping their opinions to themselves as Parker strode toward the main house, his spurs jingling with each determined step. Henry Kerrigan dismounted with all the grace his considerable girth allowed, his face flushed from the ride. "Ah, Parker, good to see you, my boy." He extended a pudgy hand which Parker shook briefly. "What brings you out here, Henry, and with a lady no less?" Parker's eyes shifted to the woman still seated on her horse, her face shadowed by a modest bonnet. "Allow me to introduce Miss Penelope Kingston," Kerrigan said, moving to help the woman dismount. "She's come from Boston to take up the teaching position at our new schoolhouse." The woman descended gracefully, refusing Kerrigan's offered hand with a polite shake of her head. When she turned to face Parker, he was struck by her composed features, neither classically beautiful nor plain, but striking in their serene intelligence. Her eyes, a clear gray, met his without flinching. "Miss Kingston," Parker said with a curt nod, not removing his hat. She inclined her head slightly but said nothing. Kerrigan cleared his throat. "Miss Kingston will be boarding at the Peterson place until suitable accommodations can be arranged in town. But I've brought her out to introduce her to the community. Several of your ranch hands have children who will be attending her school after all." Parker's brow furrowed. "And this couldn't wait until Sunday service. We're in the middle of branding, Henry." The banker's jovial expression faltered. "Well, I thought, Miss Kingston," Parker interrupted, addressing the woman directly, "welcome to Silver Creek. Now if you'll excuse me, I have a ranch to run." He turned abruptly, expecting the typical flustered or indignant response his rudeness usually provoked from civilized folk, but Penelope Kingston said nothing. Her silence followed him like a shadow, somehow louder than any protest. He turned back, irritation sparking. "Nothing to say, Miss Kingston. Most Easterners I meet can't wait to tell us how we ought to do things out here." She regarded him coolly, then simply raised an eyebrow and turned to Kerrigan. "Perhaps we should continue our tour, Mr. Kerrigan. I wouldn't want to further impose on Mr. Kincaid's valuable time." Her voice was low and melodious, without the shrill quality Parker associated with society women. And still, she directed no words at him, as though he'd rendered himself unworthy of her conversation. Parker felt an unfamiliar heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the sun. Before he could respond, Kerrigan was hastily agreeing, helping Miss Kingston back onto her horse. "We'll see you at the town meeting on Saturday, Parker," Kerrigan called as they prepared to depart. The school matters will be discussed then. Parker watched them ride away, inexplicably unsettled by the encounter. The woman's silence had been more effective than any sharp retort. It had made him feel small, uncivilized. "She's a quiet one," observed Hank, who had approached with a cup of coffee for his boss. "Too good to speak to the likes of us, more likely," Parker muttered. Accepting the coffee, Hank chuckled. Don't think that's it. The banker was chattering enough for both of them the whole ride in. Heard her ask thoughtful questions about the land, the people. Just seems she doesn't waste words, especially on men acting like bulls with a burr under their saddle. Parker shot him a warning glance, but the old man merely shrugged and ambled back toward the cookhouse. For the rest of the day, Parker found himself distracted, the schoolteacher's silent rebuke lingering in his mind. By evening, he'd worked himself into a foul mood, snapping at the cowhands and finding fault with even the most competent work. He retired to his cabin early, pouring himself a generous measure of whiskey. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a bustling Silver Creek. Parker rode in alone, having sent most of his men to the north pasture for the day's work. The town meeting was being held in the newly constructed schoolhouse, a modest wooden structure that nonetheless represented Silver Creek's aspirations for permanence and civilization. Parker entered to find nearly every seat taken, nodding curtly to acquaintances as he took a position leaning against the back wall. His eyes involuntarily sought out Miss Kingston, finding her seated primly near the front, her posture straight as a lodgepole pine. She wore a simple blue dress today, her chestnut hair swept up neatly. Mayor Simmons called the meeting to order, and various town matters were discussed: the need for another well, complaints about cattle wandering onto Main Street, plans for the Harvest Festival. Parker half listened, his attention drifting until Kerrigan stood to introduce Miss Kingston as the town's new schoolteacher. She rose gracefully, turning to face the assembled townsfolk. For the first time, Parker heard her speak at length and found himself unexpectedly captivated. "I'm honored to serve as your teacher," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I believe education is the foundation of any community's future. My classroom will welcome all children regardless of background or circumstance." A murmur rippled through the crowd at this. Silver Creek, like many frontier towns, had its share of social divisions. The wealthy ranchers' children rarely mixed with those of miners or laborers, and the few Mexican and Native American families lived on the outskirts of acceptance. "I've been told this may be unconventional," Penelope continued, undeterred. "But I assure you, knowledge knows no boundaries, and neither will my schoolroom." Parker watched as several of the wealthier ranchers exchanged displeased glances. Bradford Miller, owner of the Rocking M and Parker's chief competitor, rose to his feet. "Miss Kingston," Miller said, his tone condescending, "while your Eastern ideals are no doubt admirable, you'll find we have certain practical arrangements out here. My children wouldn't benefit from being held back by those who haven't had their advantages." Parker expected the schoolteacher to falter or retreat in the face of Miller's thinly veiled prejudice. Instead, she simply gazed at him, her silence stretching uncomfortably until Miller began to shift his weight from foot to foot. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried to every corner of the room. "Mr. Miller, I've taught in one-room schoolhouses where the children of bankers sat beside the children of blacksmiths. The only time one child holds another back is when adults teach them that some people are worth more than others. I don't intend to teach that lesson." She sat down then, leaving Miller standing awkwardly before he huffed and resumed his seat. Parker found himself fighting a smile. The schoolteacher had spine, that was certain. His momentary admiration was interrupted when Mayor Simmons addressed the next topic. "Now, regarding the schoolteacher's accommodations," the mayor began. "Miss Kingston is currently boarding with the Petersons, but with their new baby expected any day, we need to find a more permanent solution." Various suggestions were called out: rooms above the Mercantile, the widow Johnson's spare room, but each had its drawbacks, either in distance from the school or in suitability. "What about the old Logan place?" someone suggested. "It's been empty since they moved to Denver." "That roof leaks something terrible," countered another voice. "No place for a lady to stay." Parker found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thought. "The foreman's cabin at Diamond K is empty, been empty since I moved into the main house after my father passed." He was as surprised by his offer as everyone else appeared to be, all eyes turned to him, including Miss Kingston's. For the first time, he saw surprise flicker across her composed features. "It's not far from town," he continued, suddenly feeling the need to justify himself. Solid roof, good well. Better than anything else available, I reckon. Mayor Simmons blinked in astonishment. Well, that's mighty generous, Parker. What do you say, Miss Kingston? Penelope Kingston studied Parker carefully, her gray eyes searching his face as if looking for the motive behind his unexpected offer. He met her gaze steadily, surprising himself with his desire for her approval. I would need to see it first, she said finally, her voice neutral. But if it's suitable, Mr. Kincaid's offer is very kind. Parker felt an inexplicable satisfaction at her words, though they were measured and far from enthusiastic. The meeting concluded soon after, and Parker found himself waiting outside while Miss Kingston spoke with several mothers about the upcoming school term. When she finally emerged, he straightened from his slouch against the hitching post. Miss Kingston, he called, removing his hat in a belated gesture of courtesy. If you'd like to see the cabin now, I could escort you. She paused, considering him with that same thoughtful gaze that somehow made him acutely aware of the dust on his clothes and the stubble on his jaw. Thank you, Mr. Kincaid, that would be sensible. She turned to Mrs. Peterson, who had accompanied her to town. Would you mind terribly if I delayed my return? I should see if this accommodation will be suitable. After assurances from Mrs. Peterson and retrieving her horse from the livery, Penelope Kingston rode beside Parker on the trail to Diamond K Ranch. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably, and Parker found himself unusually eager to break it. You handled Miller well, he said abruptly. Most newcomers don't stand their ground with him. She glanced at him, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before she composed them again. Thank you. I found that principals rarely benefit from compromise, even when compromise might make your life easier. Especially then, she replied. The easiest path is rarely the right one, Mr. Kincaid. Her words stung with unexpected personal relevance. How many times had he chosen the easy path of anger over the harder road of patience? They crested a small rise, and the Diamond K spread before them the sprawling main house, the bunkhouse, barns, and corrals. In the distance, cattle grazed on the lush summer grass, and beyond them, the mountains rose majestically against the clear blue sky. It's beautiful, Penelope said softly, and Parker felt a surge of pride. My father built it from nothing, he said. Started with 10 head of cattle and this plot of land. By the time he died last year, we had over 2,000 head and 40,000 acres. You must miss him, she observed. Parker hadn't expected that response. Most people commented on the impressive achievement or asked about the ranch's value. Every day, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. They rode in silence to a small cabin set apart from the main ranch buildings, nestled among a stand of cottonwoods near a clear running stream. It was a simple structure, but solidly built, with a covered porch and smoke-blackened chimney. This was where I grew up, Parker said as he dismounted and moved to help her down. This time she accepted his assistance, her hand light on his arm as she descended. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through him. The cabin was dusty from disuse, but otherwise in good condition. It consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace and small kitchen, and a bedroom at the back. The furnishings were sparse but sturdy. A table with chairs, a settee, a bed frame that needed a mattress, and bookshelves built into the walls. Penelope walked slowly around the space, her expression thoughtful. She ran a finger along the bookshelves, tested the pump at the sink, and looked out each window at the views beyond. The stream is good for washing, Parker said, feeling oddly nervous about her assessment. And there's an outhouse around back that's in good repair. I can have the men bring a mattress from town and anything else you might need. She turned to him, her head slightly tilted. Why are you offering this, Mr. Kincaid? The directness of her question caught him off guard. What do you mean? Our first meeting suggested you had little interest in being neighborly. Now you're offering your family's cabin. I simply wonder why. Parker shifted uncomfortably under her steady gaze. The truth was he wasn't entirely sure himself. The cabin's sitting empty, he said finally. Seems a waste when there's need, and the school's important for the territory. Can't have a teacher living in conditions that would drive her back east at the first snowfall. A hint of a smile touched her lips. Very practical. I'm a practical man, Miss Kingston, and a man quick to anger from what I've observed. Parker stiffened. You've known me all of 2 days. Some qualities announce themselves promptly, Mr. Kincaid. Her voice held no judgment, merely observation, which somehow made it worse. You'll find most men out here have to be hard, he said defensively. The territory doesn't reward softness. There's a difference between strength and anger, she replied quietly, but I won't presume to lecture you. She turned back to survey the cabin once more. I would be grateful to accept your offer. The cabin is more than suitable, and the location is actually quite convenient to the schoolhouse. Parker nodded, oddly pleased by her acceptance despite her uncomfortably perceptive comments about his character. When would you like to move in? Would next weekend be possible? That would give me time to prepare for the start of term the following Monday. I'll have it cleaned and ready, he promised, and I'll send men to help with your belongings. As they rode back to town, Parker found himself stealing glances at his companion. In profile, with the afternoon sun lighting her features, Penelope Kingston was undeniably beautiful in a quiet, unassuming way. There was a stillness about her that both intrigued and unsettled him, as if she carried a deep well of thought beneath her composed exterior. Have you always been a teacher? He asked, surprising himself with his interest. Since I was 18, she replied. 8 years now. And what brought you all the way to Colorado territory? Surely Boston has schools enough. A shadow crossed her face. I needed a change. And I believe frontier children deserve education as much as city children. Her tone suggested there was more to the story, but Parker didn't press. Everyone in the West had something they'd left behind. He was no different. When they reached town, Parker escorted her to the Peterson home, removing his hat as she dismounted. Thank you for the cabin, Mr. Kincaid, she said formally, and for the tour. Parker, he said impulsively. My friends call me Parker. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Thank you, Parker. You may call me Penelope. As he rode back to the ranch, Parker found himself unusually aware of the beauty of the day, the wildflowers dotting the prairie, the hawks circling lazily overhead, the sweet scent of summer grass. For the first time in months, the weight of responsibility and grief that had settled on his shoulders after his father's death felt slightly lighter. The ranch hands noticed the change in their boss over the next week. His temper, while not gone, seemed less hair-triggered. When young Jimmy knocked over a bucket of milk, splattering Parker's boots, the cowboy merely sighed and sent the boy for a rag instead of the expected explosion. Old Hank watched these changes with knowing eyes. That schoolteacher's got you acting civilized, he commented one evening as Parker sat on the porch, whittling a piece of wood, something he hadn't done since his father died. Don't know what you're talking about, Parker muttered, though without real heat. Sure you don't. Hank chuckled. That's why you've had the boys scrubbing that cabin like it's going to be inspected by the president himself. Parker said nothing, focusing intently on the wood in his hands. He'd started carving it without a clear purpose, but it was taking the shape of a small bird, a meadowlark, like the ones that sang near the creek by the cabin. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Parker had arranged for 2 of his most reliable hands to take the wagon to the Peterson place and help Penelope move her belongings. He'd intended to stay behind and catch up on ranch accounts, telling himself it was inappropriate for him to be personally involved in the schoolteacher's relocation. Yet at the last minute, he found himself saddling his horse and riding into town. He caught up with the wagon just as it was being loaded with Penelope's trunks and a few pieces of furniture she'd brought from the east, a rocking chair, a writing desk, and several crates of books. Mr. Kincaid, she said, surprise evident in her voice when she saw him. I didn't expect you to come. He tipped his hat, suddenly feeling foolish. Thought I should make sure everything goes smoothly. A small smile curved her lips. Very conscientious of you. The journey back to Diamond K was pleasant, with Penelope riding beside the wagon on a mare she'd purchased from the livery. Parker found himself pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area, the valley, where a famous battle had been fought between rival tribes 20 years earlier. The mountain pass that had claimed the lives of an entire wagon train in the blizzard of '68. the hidden canyon where wild horses still roamed free. "You love this land," she observed during a pause in his narrative. "It's in my blood," he admitted. "My father taught me every creek and hill of our property before I could properly ride. Said a man who doesn't know his land doesn't deserve to own it. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Parker said softly. "Hard-headed as they come, but wise in the ways that mattered." When they arrived at the cabin, Parker was pleased by Penelope's reaction. In the week since their visit, he'd had the place thoroughly cleaned, the chimneys swept, and fresh curtains hung at the windows, an addition suggested by Mrs. Collins, the ranch cook's wife. A new mattress lay on the bed frame, made up with clean linens, and a colorful quilt that had been his mother's was folded at the foot. "It's lovely," Penelope said, genuine appreciation in her voice as she toured the transformed space. "You've gone to a great deal of trouble." Parker shrugged, embarrassed by her gratitude. Wasn't much. But he knew it had been more than necessity required: the fresh wildflowers in a mason jar on the table, the woodbox stacked high with split logs, the pantry stocked with basic provisions. All signs of a welcome he hadn't consciously intended to be quite so welcoming. The ranch hands helped bring in her belongings, carefully placing her books on the shelves and positioning her rocking chair by the fireplace according to her directions. When they'd gone, leaving Parker and Penelope alone in the cabin, an awkward silence fell. "Well," he said finally, "I'll leave you to get settled. If you need anything, the main house is just yonder." He gestured vaguely in its direction. "Thank you," she said, standing in the center of what was now her home, looking somehow both perfectly in place and utterly foreign to the rough cabin. "For everything," he nodded, unable to find words for the strange mixture of emotions her presence evoked, and took his leave. That evening, he found himself sitting on the porch of the main house, watching the glow of lamplight from the cabin windows in the distance. The thought of Penelope Kingston arranging her books, perhaps sitting in her rocking chair reading, created an inexplicable warmth in his chest. Over the next 2 weeks, Parker found reasons to ride past the cabin, each day checking fences, he told himself, or surveying the creek for any beaver dams that might cause flooding. Sometimes Penelope would be outside, tending to the small flower bed she'd started, or simply sitting on the porch with a book. She would wave, and he would tip his hat, occasionally stopping for brief conversations that grew less stilted with each encounter. He learned she was 26, the daughter of a professor at Harvard, and had taught in Boston until circumstances which she still did not elaborate upon had prompted her westward journey. She had a younger brother studying medicine and parents who had been reluctant to see her venture to the frontier. She loved poetry, could name every constellation in the night sky, and had strong opinions on educational philosophy that she expressed with quiet passion. In turn, Parker found himself sharing more than he'd intended about his own life: his mother's death when he was 12, his father's stern but loving upbringing, his brief rebellious period when he'd run with a rough crowd in Denver before returning to take his place at the ranch. He told her about his dreams for Diamond K, the improvements he planned, the legacy he hoped to build. The school term began, and Penelope was soon busy with her students, 23 children ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, from all backgrounds as she'd promised. Parker heard through ranch gossip that she was already beloved by her pupils, firm but kind, expecting excellence but providing the support to achieve it. Bradford Miller's opposition hadn't faded, however. The wealthy rancher made his displeasure known about Penelope's integrated classroom, particularly when she seated his 10-year-old daughter next to the son of a Mexican ranch hand. "She's stirring up trouble," Hank reported one evening, having returned from town with supplies and the latest news. "Miller's threatening to start his own private school if she doesn't reconsider her approach." Parker felt a surge of protective anger. "Miller's a fool, always has been." "Maybe," Hank agreed, "but he's a fool with money and influence, could make things hard for your schoolteacher." "She's not my schoolteacher," Parker said automatically, though the denial felt hollow even to his own ears. Hank just chuckled and went back to preparing dinner. The following Saturday, Parker rode into town for supplies and found himself lingering near the schoolhouse. Through the open windows, he could hear Penelope's voice as she worked with a few students who had come for extra help, patient, encouraging, gently insistent on precision. He waited until the children had departed before approaching the door, hat in hand. Penelope looked up from her desk, surprise giving way to a warm smile that sent his heart racing in a most unexpected manner. "Parker," she said, rising to greet him. "What brings you to town?" "Ranch business," he said vaguely. "Thought I'd see how you're settling in. At the cabin, I mean." "And the school?" "Both are wonderful," she assured him. "The children are eager to learn, and the cabin is the most peaceful home I've had in years." He nodded, pleased. "I hear Miller's been causing trouble." Her smile faded slightly. "Mr. Miller has strong opinions about education." "But so do I. If he threatens you, he hasn't," she interrupted gently. "And if he did, I'm quite capable of handling such situations, Parker." He frowned. "I don't doubt that, but out here men like Miller are no different from men like him in Boston," she finished. "Wealth and privilege speak the same language everywhere, but so does determination." Her quiet confidence both impressed and frustrated him. "At least let me ride back with you," he said. "I'm headed that way anyhow." This wasn't strictly true. He'd planned to visit the saloon before returning, but the prospect of Penelope's company was suddenly far more appealing than a whiskey and a game of cards. They rode side by side through the golden afternoon, their conversation flowing more easily now that they'd begun to know each other. As they passed the church, Penelope mentioned the harvest festival planned for the following weekend. "Will you attend?" she asked. Parker shrugged. "Never been one for social gatherings." "That's a shame," she said, her tone light. "I was hoping for a dance partner who wouldn't step on my toes." He glanced at her sharply, catching the teasing glint in her gray eyes. "Are you suggesting I know how to dance, Miss Kingston?" "I've observed that you move with considerable grace for such a large man, Mr. Kincaid. I merely made an educated assumption about your dancing abilities." Parker couldn't help but laugh. "My mother insisted I learn. Said no son of hers would shuffle around a dance floor like a bear with a thorn in his paw." "A wise woman," Penelope said with a smile. "So will you attend? Put that way, how could he refuse?" "I suppose I could make an appearance." Her pleased expression was reward enough for his concession. As they neared the turnoff to her cabin, gunshots suddenly rang out from the direction of the main ranch house. Parker immediately tensed, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Stay here," he ordered, all trace of humor gone from his voice, but Penelope was already urging her horse forward. Someone could be hurt. Cursing under his breath, Parker spurred his horse to catch up, reaching out to grasp her reins. "This isn't a classroom dispute, Penelope. Those are gunshots." "Which is precisely why someone might need help," she countered, her calm determination maddening. Before he could argue further, they crested the rise that gave them a view of the ranch yard. 4 men on horseback were facing off against several of Parker's ranch hands. Even from a distance, Parker recognized the intruders, the Blackwell brothers, cattle rustlers who'd been terrorizing ranches throughout the territory. "Damn it," he muttered. "Penelope, ride to your cabin and stay there. These men are dangerous." She hesitated, clearly torn between concern and self-preservation. "Parker, please," he said, the word unfamiliar on his lips. "I can't focus if I'm worried about you." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she nodded reluctantly and turned her horse toward the cabin. Parker galloped toward the confrontation, drawing his revolver as he approached. "Blackwells," he shouted. "You're trespassing on Diamond K land." The 4 brothers turned at his voice, their expressions a mixture of surprise and malice. The eldest, Jeremiah Blackwell, sneered openly. "Well, if it ain't the mighty Parker Kincaid," he called. "We were just explaining to your boys that we'll be helping ourselves to some of your fine cattle. Been a hard season, you understand." "The only thing you'll be helping yourselves to is a jail cell," Parker replied, his voice cold as he positioned his horse between the rustlers and his men. "Now ride out before this gets ugly." Jeremiah laughed, an ugly sound. "4 of us, 1 of you. Your boys here are barely armed." "I'd say ugly is exactly what you're facing, Kincaid." Parker assessed the situation quickly. His ranch hands had only 2 rifles among them, having been caught unaware while working in the yard. The Blackwells were all armed with revolvers and rifles. "Last chance," Parker said, his finger tensing on the trigger. What happened next unfolded in seconds. The youngest Blackwell brother made a sudden move toward his gun, and Parker fired, striking the man's arm. Chaos erupted as the other brothers opened fire, forcing Parker to dive from his horse for cover behind a water trough. Bullets splintered wood around him as he returned fire, aware of his men scrambling for what protection they could find. He managed to wing another Blackwell, but they had the advantage of position and firepower. Then, unbelievably, the schoolhouse bell began to ring loud, insistent peals cutting through the gunfire. Everyone paused in momentary confusion, turning toward the sound. Parker's heart sank when he saw Penelope standing on the porch of the main house, ringing the dinner bell with determined force, making herself a perfect target. "Penelope," he shouted in horror. "Get down!" But she continued ringing, and now Parker understood her strategy. The bell would be heard for miles, signaling to neighboring ranches that something was wrong at Diamond K. The Blackwells would know this too. Help would be coming. Jeremiah Blackwell raised his rifle, aiming at Penelope. Without thought, Parker broke from cover, firing rapidly as he ran toward the house. His bullet caught Jeremiah in the shoulder, spinning him around and spoiling his aim. The rustler's shot went wild, splintering the porch post beside Penelope's head. "We need to go." One of the other brothers shouted, clearly recognizing their narrowing window for escape. Jeremiah hesitated, clearly wanting to finish what he'd started, but another volley of shots from Parker's position decided him. The Blackwells retreated, galloping away toward the east, 2 of them nursing wounds. Parker raced to the porch, his heart hammering wildly in his chest. "Are you out of your mind?" he shouted, grabbing Penelope's shoulders. "They could have killed you." She set down the bell, her face pale but composed. "They were going to kill you," she said simply. "You were outgunned and outnumbered, so you made yourself a target." His voice cracked with the terror he'd felt seeing her exposed to danger. "I made a calculated decision," she replied, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. The bell would bring help, and it would force them to choose between a quick retreat or a prolonged fight they might not win. Parker stared at her, torn between rage at her recklessness and awe at her courage. "You could have been shot." "So could you," she countered. "In fact, you nearly were, several times." The adrenaline of the moment, the fear he'd felt for her safety, and the realization of what might have been lost converged in a surge of emotion Parker couldn't contain. Without conscious decision, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if to reassure himself she was truly unharmed. Penelope stiffened in surprise, before gradually relaxing against him, her arms cautiously encircling his waist. They stood like that for what felt like both an eternity and not nearly long enough, the rapid beating of their hearts gradually slowing to a steadier rhythm. When Parker finally released her, stepping back awkwardly, he found himself unable to meet her eyes. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "That was improper." "Yes," she agreed softly, "but not unwelcome." His gaze snapped to hers, finding no reproach there, only a warmth that stirred something long dormant within him. The moment was broken by the arrival of his ranch hands, coming to report that no one had been seriously injured in the attack, and that riders from the neighboring Triple J Ranch were already approaching, having heard the bell. In the commotion that followed explaining what had happened, sending men to track the Blackwells, tending to minor injuries, Parker had no opportunity to speak privately with Penelope again. By the time things had settled, she had quietly slipped away to her cabin, leaving him with an unsettled feeling that was both uncomfortable and strangely exhilarating. The next day, Sunday, found Parker restless and distracted. He attended to necessary chores mechanically, his thoughts repeatedly turning to Penelope and the brief moment they had shared. By afternoon, he could no longer resist the urge to see her, to ensure she was truly well after the previous day's excitement. He approached her cabin with uncharacteristic uncertainty, relieved to see smoke rising from the chimney, suggesting she was at home. His knock was answered promptly, Penelope appearing in the doorway with a book in hand and a questioning expression that softened when she recognized him. "Parker," she said, "please come in." The cabin was warm and inviting, scented with something baking in the small oven. Penelope had arranged her belongings artfully, creating a space that somehow blended her Eastern refinement with the rustic simplicity of the frontier. Books lined the shelves, a half-finished letter lay on her writing desk, and the rocking chair by the fire held a partially completed piece of needlework. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said, standing awkwardly just inside the door, hat in hand. "Yesterday was intense." "I'm quite well," she assured him, gesturing for him to sit at the table. "Though I must admit I had some difficulty sleeping. Gunfights are not a common occurrence in Boston drawing rooms." He smiled reluctantly at her attempt at humor. "They're not a common occurrence at Diamond K either, usually." "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise." She moved to the stove, lifting a kettle. "Would you like some tea or coffee if you prefer? Coffee would be welcome, thank you." As she prepared the beverage, Parker found himself studying the graceful movement of her hands, the way the afternoon sun through the window caught auburn highlights in her dark hair, the quiet confidence in her posture. She was unlike any woman he had ever known, combining strength and gentleness in a way that continually surprised him. "You were very brave yesterday," he said when she placed a steaming cup before him. "Foolish, but brave." She sat across from him, cradling her own cup of tea. "I could say the same about you, running from cover to stop that man from shooting me. That's different, is it?" Her gray eyes held his steadily. "Why, because you're a man and I'm a woman. Because I'm trained to handle situations like that," he countered. "I've been in gunfights before." "You're a schoolteacher." "A schoolteacher who made a logical decision based on the circumstances," she replied. "The bell was the right choice, Parker. It saved lives, possibly yours included." He couldn't argue with her assessment, though the thought of her in danger still made his blood run cold. "Just don't do it again." A small smile curved her lips. "Are you giving me an order, Mr. Kincaid?" "A request," he amended, surprising himself with his moderation. The Parker Kincaid of a month ago would have insisted, would have demanded. "Then I shall consider it carefully," she said, her tone gently teasing. "Though I make no promises about future bell ringing should the need arise." Parker found himself chuckling despite his concern. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." "I prefer determined," she corrected. "And you're one to talk about stubbornness, from what I've observed." Their conversation flowed easily after that, ranging from the Blackwell brothers, now being pursued by a posse from Silver Creek, to the progress of her students to Parker's plans for improving the ranch's breeding stock. Hours passed without either noticing, until the setting sun cast long shadows across the cabin floor. "I should go," Parker said reluctantly, rising from his chair. "You probably have lessons to prepare." "Always," she acknowledged, walking with him to the door. "Though I've enjoyed the distraction." He paused on the threshold, suddenly awkward again. "About yesterday when we," he gestured vaguely, unable to find the right words. "When you embraced me," she supplied calmly. "Yes," he cleared his throat. "I want you to know I respect you, Penelope. I didn't mean to take liberties." Her expression softened. "Fear makes us act on feelings we might otherwise keep hidden. I understand that." Parker's heart quickened at her words. "Feelings." A delicate blush colored her cheeks, but her gaze remained steady. "I believe we both know that what exists between us has grown beyond mere neighborly regard, Parker." The directness of her statement, so typical of her character, both startled and pleased him. "You're right," he admitted. "Though I'm not sure what to do about it. I'm not. I don't have much practice with." He trailed off, frustrated by his inability to articulate his thoughts. "Nor do I," she confessed. "Perhaps we need not rush to define it." "The Harvest Festival," he said suddenly. "Would you allow me to escort you? Properly, I mean." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I would be honored, Parker." He left her cabin with a lightness in his step that had been absent for longer than he could remember. The knowledge that Penelope Kingston returned his regard, undefined though it might be, filled him with a quiet joy that tempered even his lingering concern about the Blackwells' threat. The week leading up to the Harvest Festival passed in a flurry of activity. The Blackwells had fled the territory, according to reports, but Parker increased security at the ranch nonetheless. The cattle drive season was approaching, and preparations consumed much of his time. Still, he found moments to ride past Penelope's cabin, sometimes stopping briefly to talk, other times just exchanging waves as she hurried to or from school. On the day of the festival, Parker found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, examining his appearance critically in the mirror. He'd had a bath, trimmed his beard, and donned his best shirt and vest. He even polished his boots, an act that drew knowing grins from the ranch hands who observed this uncharacteristic attention to grooming. "Don't say a word," Parker warned Hank when the old cook raised an eyebrow at him. "Wasn't going to," Hank replied innocently. "Just thinking your pa would be pleased to see you taking an interest in something besides cattle and fences." Parker harumphed, but couldn't entirely suppress a smile. His father had indeed often encouraged him to find a good woman before he became too set in his ornery ways to be worth having. The church and adjacent meadow had been transformed for the harvest festival. Lanterns hung from trees, tables groaned under the weight of food brought by every family in the community, and a small band of local musicians tuned their instruments on a makeshift stage. Children darted about in excited groups, women gossiped in clusters, and men stood in circles discussing cattle prices and weather predictions. Parker arrived alone, having arranged to meet Penelope at the festival rather than call for her at her cabin, a concession to propriety that seemed important, though he wasn't entirely sure why. He scanned the growing crowd anxiously, nodding distractedly to acquaintances who greeted him. When he finally spotted her, his breath caught in his throat. Penelope wore a dress of deep green that complemented her coloring perfectly, her hair arranged more elaborately than her usual simple style, with a few curls framing her face. She looked beautiful, but it was her smile when she saw him warm, genuine, and somehow private despite the public setting that truly captivated him. "You look." He began as he approached her, words failing him once again. "Thank you," she said, saving him from his inadequacy with language. "You look very handsome yourself." He offered his arm, which she took with a grace that made the simple gesture seem significant. Together, they moved through the festival, stopping to speak with neighbors and students, sampling the abundant food, and gradually relaxing into the celebration. When the band began to play, Parker hesitated only briefly before turning to her. "Would you care to dance, Miss Kingston?" Her eyes sparkled with pleasure. "I would indeed, Mr. Kincaid." His mother's insistence on dancing lessons proved its worth as Parker led Penelope onto the area cleared for dancing. He moved with confidence, guiding her through the lively tune with a skill that clearly surprised and delighted her. "You dance beautifully," she said as they circled the floor. "Another hidden talent." "Not so hidden," he replied, "just rarely used." They danced several more times, alternating between energetic reels and slower waltzes. During one such waltz, with Penelope's hand warm in his and her waist beneath his other palm, Parker found himself speaking from the heart. "You've changed things," he said softly for her ears alone. "Since you came." She looked up at him questioningly. "Changed what? Me," he admitted. "The way I see things, the way I react." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "I've noticed you seem calmer these days." He nodded, guiding her around a slower couple. "My father always said my quick temper would be my downfall, said I needed to learn to think before I acted. But it wasn't until I saw how you handle things with that quiet strength that I really understood what he meant. Your silence that first day," he continued. "When I was rude to you, it affected me more than any angry retort could have, made me feel small and foolish." "That wasn't my intention," she said, "I know, but it was what I needed." His hand tightened slightly on hers. "You make me want to be better, Penelope." The music ended, but they remained standing close together, the moment stretching between them with unspoken meaning. Their intimate exchange was interrupted by the harsh voice of Bradford Miller. "Well, isn't this cozy?" he said, approaching them with obvious disapproval. "The schoolteacher and the rancher, quite a pair." Parker felt Penelope stiffen beside him, though her expression remained composed. "Good evening, Mr. Miller," she said evenly. "Are you enjoying the festival?" Miller ignored her pleasantry. I've just been speaking with several concerned parents about your teaching methods, Miss Kingston. Seems you've been filling our children's heads with some rather inappropriate ideas. Parker felt his temper rising but forced himself to remain calm, taking his cue from Penelope's dignified posture. "This isn't the time or place for such discussions, Miller," he said, his voice level despite the anger building within him. "On the contrary," Miller replied. "The whole town should hear about how she's teaching that Indians have cultural value and that Mexican children deserve the same education as our own." "They are our own," Penelope said quietly but firmly. "Every child in my classroom is part of this community." Miller's face reddened. "That kind of thinking might fly in Boston, but out here, we understand the natural order of things. Some people are simply better than others, Miss Kingston. That's God's truth." Parker's hands clenched into fists, but before he could respond, Penelope placed a gentle hand on his arm. The simple touch grounded him, reminding him of their earlier conversation. Instead of the explosive response that would once have been inevitable, Parker took a deep breath and spoke deliberately. "The only person showing themselves to be lesser here is you, Miller. Miss Kingston is bringing education and opportunity to all the children of this community. If you can't see the value in that, then I pity you." Miller's expression darkened with anger. "You'll regret taking her side in this, Kincaid. I have influence in this territory." "And I have principles," Parker replied calmly. "As does Miss Kingston. I believe I know which will stand the test of time." Several onlookers had gathered during the exchange, and Parker was gratified to see nods of approval from many of them. Miller, realizing he was losing the public confrontation, stormed away with a final muttered threat. Parker turned to Penelope, concerned that the incident had spoiled the evening for her. But instead of distress, he found admiration in her eyes. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You controlled your anger," she said. "A month ago you might have knocked him down for speaking that way." Parker rubbed the back of his neck ruefully. "I wanted to, still do if I'm honest. But you didn't," she emphasized. "You chose your words instead of your fists. That's growth, Parker." Her approval meant more to him than he could express. "Had a good teacher," he said with a small smile. The rest of the evening passed pleasantly, the confrontation with Miller fading as they enjoyed the festivities. By the time the last dance was announced, Parker found himself reluctant for the night to end. "May I escort you home?" he asked as the musicians began packing their instruments. "I would appreciate that," she replied. The ride back to Diamond Cay was peaceful, the night sky ablaze with stars and a nearly full moon lighting their way. They rode side by side, companionably silent, each lost in thoughts of the evening and what it might mean for their future. At her cabin, Parker helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. The moonlight cast her face in silver and shadow, emphasizing her delicate features. "I had a wonderful time," she said softly, "as did I." He hesitated, then added, "Penelope, I want you to know that I'll stand by you against Miller or anyone else who tries to interfere with your teaching. What you're doing is important." Her expression softened. "Thank you. That means a great deal to me." There was so much more he wanted to say about his growing feelings for her, his admiration for her courage and principles, his hope that she might consider a future that included him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself leaning forward slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if his advance was unwelcome. She didn't move, her gray eyes steady on his, and when their lips met, it was with a gentleness that belied the intensity of emotion behind it. The kiss was brief but profound, a promise and a question all at once. When they parted, Penelope's cheeks were flushed, but her gaze was clear and direct as ever. "Good night, Parker," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Good night, Penelope," he replied, watching as she entered her cabin before mounting his horse and riding slowly toward the main house, his thoughts a whirl of hope and possibility. The weeks that followed were among the happiest of Parker's life. His relationship with Penelope deepened as autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson. They established a pattern of Sunday afternoon rides, exploring the ranch's far corners and sharing stories of their lives. In the evenings, they would often sit on her porch, reading aloud to each other from her collection of books or simply talking as the stars emerged overhead. Parker found himself changing in ways both subtle and profound. His notorious temper, once the talk of the territory, now rarely surfaced. When challenges arose, a dispute among the hands, cattle breaking through fencing, complications with suppliers, he found himself pausing, considering his words before speaking, often hearing Penelope's measured voice in his mind. The ranch hands noticed the change, commenting among themselves about the civilizing influence of the schoolteacher. Even in town, people remarked on the transformation of Diamond Kincaid's volatile owner into a more measured, thoughtful man, still strong and decisive, but no longer ruled by his impulses. Bradford Miller continued his campaign against Penelope's teaching methods, but found less support than he'd expected. The children's enthusiasm for learning and Penelope's obvious dedication had won over many initially skeptical parents. Parker's public support carried weight as well. As one of the largest landowners in the territory, his endorsement mattered. One crisp November afternoon, as Parker finished checking the winter preparations in the north pasture, he found himself riding toward the schoolhouse. Classes would be ending soon, and the thought of seeing Penelope, even briefly, pulled him like a lodestone. He arrived just as the children were being dismissed, their excited voices carrying on the clear air as they spilled out into the schoolyard. Several called greetings to him, now a familiar figure at school events and activities. He dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post, and waited for the last students to depart. Inside, he found Penelope at her desk, reviewing a stack of arithmetic papers. She looked up at his entrance, her face lighting with pleasure. "This is a nice surprise," she said, setting aside her work. "Thought I might escort you home," he replied, moving to stand beside her desk. "It's getting colder in the evenings," she smiled, seeing through his practical excuse. "How thoughtful of you." As she gathered her things, Parker noticed a letter on her desk, the Boston postmark clearly visible. "News from home?" he asked casually, though a sudden unease stirred within him. Penelope's expression flickered with something hesitation, concern, before she nodded. "From my brother. He's completed his medical studies and taken a position at Boston City Hospital. You must be proud of him." "Very," she agreed, carefully placing the letter in her satchel. "He's worked incredibly hard." There was something in her tone that prompted Parker to ask, "Do you miss it? Boston, I mean." She considered the question thoughtfully. "I miss certain aspects, the libraries, the concerts, the bustle of city life, and my family, of course." She closed her satchel and turned to face him fully. "But I've found things here that I never had there." "Such as?" he prompted, needing to hear her answer. Her gray eyes met his directly. "Purpose, independence, a community that's becoming home." She paused, then added softly, "You." The simple words sent warmth spreading through his chest. Parker reached for her hand, entwining their fingers. "I was thinking," he began, suddenly nervous, "about Christmas." "What about it? It's only a few weeks away. I thought perhaps, that is, if you'd like." He took a deep breath, frustrated by his own awkwardness. "I'd like you to join me for Christmas dinner at the main house, just us." Her smile was radiant. "I'd love that," Parker encouraged, he continued, "and there's something else, something I've been wanting to ask you." Her expression grew serious, sensing the weight of his words. "Yes." Before he could continue, the schoolhouse door burst open, and young Jimmy from the ranch rushed in, his face flushed with exertion. "Mr. Kincaid, Miss Kingston, come quick, there's a fire at the ranch." Parker's heart froze. "Where?" "The north barn," Jimmy gasped, "and it's spreading fast." Without hesitation, Parker and Penelope hurried outside. Even from town, they could see the dark column of smoke rising against the pale sky. They mounted quickly, Penelope on her mare, and Parker lifting Jimmy onto his horse behind him, and galloped toward Diamond K. As they approached, the scene that greeted them was chaotic. The north barn was engulfed in flames, the fire threatening to spread to nearby structures. Ranch hands formed a bucket brigade from the well to the edges of the blaze, while others worked to lead frightened horses from the adjoining corral to safety. Parker leapt from his horse, immediately taking charge. "Get those horses to the south pasture," he shouted. "And someone ride to the Triple J for help, they've got more men." He turned to Penelope, who had dismounted beside him. "Stay back," he urged. "It's not safe." But she was already moving toward a group of injured men, her practical nature asserting itself. "I can help with the wounded," she said firmly. "Just be careful, Parker." For hours, they battled the blaze. Reinforcements arrived from neighboring ranches, bringing additional buckets, blankets, and willing hands. The women of Diamond K, led by Mrs. Collins, organized care for those suffering burns and smoke inhalation, with Penelope working tirelessly among them. By nightfall, they had contained the fire, though the north barn was a complete loss. Several other buildings had suffered damage, and 3 ranch hands had been injured seriously enough to require the doctor's attention. Exhausted, smoke-blackened men slumped against whatever support they could find, accepting cups of coffee and words of gratitude from Parker. "Any idea how it started?" Parker asked Hank as they surveyed the smoldering ruins. The old cook's expression was grim. "Tom found empty kerosene cans behind the tack room. This wasn't no accident, Parker." Cold fury washed through him. "The Blackwells." "Maybe," Hank said, but his tone suggested doubt. "Though they've been gone from the territory for weeks, according to the sheriff." Parker's mind raced through other possibilities. He had competitors, certainly, but none who would resort to such tactics except perhaps one. "Miller," he said, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "That's my thinking," Hank agreed. "After you stood up to him at the festival, and with how things have been going with the school, man like that don't take humiliation lightly." Parker's hands clenched into fists, the old familiar rage building within him. He wanted nothing more than to ride to Miller's ranch and confront him directly, violently. The impulse was almost overwhelming. "Parker." Penelope's voice broke through his dark thoughts. She stood nearby, her dress soot-stained, her hair coming loose from its pins, concern evident in her expression. "We think it was deliberate," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Miller's work, most likely." She moved closer, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "What are you planning to do?" The question, simple as it was, forced him to pause. The Parker Kincaid of months ago would have already been on his horse, riding toward confrontation without thought for consequences. But that man had been changed by the quiet strength of the woman beside him. "What I should do," he said slowly, "is get evidence, go to the sheriff, handle this legally." She nodded, relief evident in her eyes. "That would be wise." "But what I want to do," he admitted, "is beat him senseless." "I know," she said softly. "And the fact that you recognize the difference between what you want and what you should do shows how far you've come." Her faith in him was humbling. Parker took a deep breath, letting the worst of his anger dissipate. "I'll send men to town at first light to fetch the sheriff. And I'll post guards tonight in case they try again." "A sound plan," she agreed. She hesitated, then added, "I should return to my cabin." "No," Parker said immediately. "It's not safe. If they targeted the ranch once, they might again. You'll stay in the main house tonight." She looked about to protest, then nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his concern. "Very well, but I should get fresh clothes first." "I'll send someone with you," Parker insisted. "I need to organize the night watch." As Penelope departed with one of the more trustworthy ranch hands as escort, Parker set about arranging guards at strategic points around the ranch. The work kept his mind focused, preventing it from dwelling too deeply on thoughts of revenge. Hours later, with security measures in place and the injured being tended to, Parker finally entered the main house. He found Penelope in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Collins prepare food for the exhausted ranch hands. "You should rest," he told her, noting the weariness in her face despite her determined activity. "As should you," she countered, but allowed him to lead her to the parlor, where a fire burned warmly in the grate. They sat side by side on the sofa, the events of the day settling heavily upon them. Penelope leaned against him slightly, and he put his arm around her shoulders, drawing strength from her presence. "I've prepared the guest room for you," he said after a comfortable silence. "Thank you." She turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Parker, about what happened today." "I'm proud of you." He raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Your reaction to discovering it was arson," she explained. "The old Parker might have ridden off immediately, looking for someone to blame." "I wanted to," he admitted. "But you didn't." You considered consequences, you chose the wiser path. Her hand found his, squeezing gently. That's the measure of true strength, not how quickly one can draw a gun or throw a punch. Her words warmed him in a way the fire couldn't. I had a good teacher, he said, echoing his statement from the festival. A small smile curved her lips. An exceptionally stubborn student, but a good one nonetheless. He chuckled, then sobered. What I was going to ask you earlier at the schoolhouse before we were interrupted. She met his gaze steadily. Yes, Parker took a deep breath. I love you, Penelope. I think I have almost from the beginning, though I was too stubborn to recognize it at first. Your quiet strength, your principles, your kindness, they've changed me, changed my life in ways I never expected. Her eyes widened, a flush spreading across her cheeks. Parker, please, let me finish, he said gently. I know we've known each other only a few months. I know this might seem sudden, but out here life is uncertain. Today proved that. I don't want to waste time when I'm sure of my feelings. He took her hands in his. I'm asking if you might consider a future with me. Not immediately, I know you need time and there's your teaching to consider, but eventually, as my wife, tears glistened in her gray eyes. Oh, Parker, she whispered, his heart sank at her tone. If it's too soon, no, she interrupted, squeezing his hands. It's not that. She took a shaky breath. There's something I haven't told you about why I left Boston. Parker steeled himself for whatever revelation was coming. You can tell me anything. I was engaged, she said quietly. To another teacher at the school where I taught. We were to be married last spring. Jealousy, unexpected and sharp, twisted in his chest. What happened? I discovered he had another life, another fiancée, in fact, in a different part of the city. When I confronted him, She paused, composing herself. He became violent, not severely, but enough to frighten me. When I broke our engagement, he used his influence to have me dismissed from my position. Anger flared in Parker, but it was a different sort than his old impulsive rage. This was protective, focused. He hurt you, only once, she assured him, but it was enough to destroy my trust. That's why I came west to start fresh, somewhere my reputation hadn't been tarnished by his lies. And now, Parker asked, his heart in his throat, do you still carry those scars? Her expression softened. I carried them when I arrived, but I've found healing here, Parker, through my work, through this community. She reached up to touch his face gently. Through you. Hope rekindled in his chest. Does that mean, it means I love you too, she said simply. You've shown me what real strength looks like, not domination or control, but protection and respect. Your journey to master your temper has helped me overcome my fears. Joy surged through him, but he forced himself to ask one more question. And my proposal? Her smile was radiant through her tears. Yes, Parker Kincaid, I will marry you. He gathered her into his arms, his heart fuller than he'd ever thought possible. Their kiss was tender at first, then deepening with the promise of their shared future. The following days brought both challenges and resolutions. Sheriff Taylor investigated the fire, and combined with testimony from a ranch hand who'd seen suspicious riders near Diamond K property that day, gathered enough evidence to arrest Bradford Miller. The wealthy rancher denied involvement, but his foreman, under pressure, eventually confessed that Miller had ordered the arson in retaliation for Parker's public support of Penelope's teaching methods. Miller was charged and eventually convicted, his influence in the territory permanently diminished. The community rallied around Diamond K, helping to rebuild the destroyed barn before winter set in fully. Parker's measured handling of the crisis, pursuing justice through legal means, rather than personal vengeance, earned him new respect throughout Silver Creek. Parker and Penelope were married on Christmas Eve in the Silver Creek Church, decorated with evergreens and candles for the occasion. She wore a gown of ivory silk that her mother had sent from Boston, along with a letter expressing cautious happiness for her daughter's new life. Parker, uncharacteristically nervous, fumbled slightly with the ring but spoke his vows in a clear, unwavering voice that carried to every corner of the packed church. Their Christmas dinner, originally planned as an intimate occasion, became a celebration for the entire ranch, with tables set up in the main house's spacious dining room and parlor. Amidst the festivities, Parker and Penelope occasionally exchanged private glances, silently acknowledging the deeper joy they shared. That night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone in the main house that was now their shared home, Parker took his wife's hands in his. "I have something for you," he said, leading her to his study. On his desk lay a leather-bound book. He handed it to her, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not much for fancy gifts, but I thought, well, open it." Penelope carefully opened the cover to reveal blank pages, except for an inscription on the first leaf, written in Parker's surprisingly elegant hand. "For my wife, whose silence taught me wisdom and whose love taught me patience." Her eyes glistened as she looked up at him. "It's beautiful." "But I don't understand. It's a journal," he explained. "For your thoughts about the school, your teaching methods, I thought maybe someday you might want to write a book to share your approach with other teachers on the frontier." She gazed at him in wonder. "You've thought about my future work." "Our future," he corrected gently. "I want you to know that I don't expect marriage to change your calling, Penelope. The school needs you, the children need you, and I'm proud to support your work however I can." "Oh, Parker," she whispered, setting the journal carefully aside before stepping into his embrace. "I never thought I could find someone who would understand what my teaching means to me. I might be slow to learn," he said, smiling down at her, "but I do get there eventually." The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure. The Diamond K prospered under Parker's increasingly respected leadership, expanding its operations to include not only cattle, but also horse breeding. Penelope's school flourished as well, eventually moving to a larger building in town as Silver Creek grew. Her progressive methods attracted attention throughout the territory, and educators occasionally traveled great distances to observe her classroom. Their first child, a daughter named Elizabeth after Parker's mother, arrived a year after their marriage, followed 2 years later by a son they named James. Parker proved to be a devoted father, his once volatile temper now channeled into protecting and nurturing his family. On their 5th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch of the main house watching their children play under the watchful eye of Mrs. Collins, Penelope turned to her husband with a contemplative smile. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If I had responded to your rudeness that first day with anger instead of silence," Parker considered this, his hand warm around hers, "I'd likely still be the same hot-headed fool I was then, respected for my ranch perhaps, but not for myself." "And us?" she prompted. "There would be no us," he said simply. "A woman like you wouldn't have tolerated a man like I was." She leaned against his shoulder. "I saw potential in you from the beginning, you know, even through your bluster," he chuckled. "You saw what no one else did then, even me." "That's what love does," she said softly. "It sees possibilities where others see only what is." Parker gazed out at the land that had been in his family for 2 generations, now stretching as far as the eye could see, secured for future generations, their children and, someday, their grandchildren. The Diamond K had always been his legacy, but Penelope had given him something even more valuable, a life of purpose and balance, of strength tempered by wisdom. "Thank you," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "For what?" "For your silence when I needed it. And for your words when I was ready to hear them." As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of gold and crimson, Parker Kincaid, once the most quick-tempered man in the territory, held his wife close, grateful for the quiet strength that had transformed his life and the love that continued to shape his heart.